I don't know if I should thank or curse Rick Bonner for twisting my arm to provide the forestry perspective. In reviewing past presentations that I've given, I actually gave a very similar one in 2007.
So it was so hard.
Well, if I'd have looked at it earlier, it wouldn't have been so hard because I could have taken many of the same messages because they haven't changed. So that is one comment. Another one is one of Rick's introductory comments, Rick Blackwood, in terms of we've been saying to the government through a variety of multi-stakeholder groups, the recovery planning process, that the time for action is now. And I'm not sure if it's like working with my dad where you need to give him the idea a number of times before it becomes his own, or if we were just saying it wrong. Because Rick rephrased it and said, now is the time to move forward, not the time for action is now. So I'm glad to hear it, Rick, and we will be monitoring progress on that commitment under the new policy. So I appreciate that. I've taken a slightly different tact than Amit. I think they're complementary. I've focused more on sort of the forest industry and its relationship specifically to caribou conservation planning. Recognizing, however, that in my humble opinion, the caribou conservation issue is a cumulative effects issue and requires a cumulative effects solution. So I think taken together, the presentations that we've seen this morning complement each other, and we need to take ideas from all of them as we move forward in implementing caribou conservation planning. Acknowledgements here are some of the logos. Missing is Warehouser, my apologies, Wendy, from people that have provided input. Came in late. What I did for preparing for this presentation was I solicited input from companies, and a number of them responded, thank you very much, in terms of providing me with direct information that I used to generate this presentation. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm not going to be focusing on any company-specific actions. I may be using examples from a few of the companies. I will be using examples to highlight some of the strategies, but the strategies in many cases will be being implemented by a variety of companies. So in addition to acknowledging their input, I'm also sharing the podium in terms of any questions that may come up at the end or over the next day and a half. I may be able to answer them directly, or I may pass the mic to one of my co-authors. Provide a bit of an overview right now. I'm going to move through these sections. I think it's important to provide a little bit of ecological and geographic context relative to this merging of forestry as well as caribou conservation. And then I'll work through some examples in terms of forest management planning through to forest management operations, and then end off with some of the things that kind of brings it back together in terms of this being a cumulative effects problem and a cumulative effects solution as we move into the ideas of engagement, action planning, and close off on some comments on challenges and opportunities. So as we know in Alberta, this is an Alberta-centric presentation. We've got two ecotypes here, both boreal and mountain. And I bring that up for two reasons. One is a bit of a reminder, but two, when you look at the ecotypes, there are different relationships relative to forestry for each of the two ecotypes. The mountain ecotype, most of them are migratory, moving in predictable seasonal migration into and out of forested foothills. And those forested foothills, the forest types that the caribou are occupying, are also the same, call it habitat type, that the forestry companies are operating in. So caribou habitat equals merchantable timber. With the boreal ecotype, they are non-migratory and largely occupied peatlands. There is some use of upland pine, a small amount of that would be considered merchantable. So in this case, there is a relatively small overlap, direct overlap between caribou habitat and quote-unquote forestry habitat. So the timber harvesting is happening adjacent to, not in, caribou habitat. Within both the boreal and the mountain ecotypes, we do have, in a variety of the herd ranges, cross-jurisdictional issues with BC, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan. And so that's sort of a theme that crosses all of the different herd types. Touch briefly on relationship between sort of limiting factors and forestry. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because we've seen it before, but again, the focus of this talk is sort of looking directly at sort of some of the forestry-related effects relative to caribou conservation. And so a number of aspects relate to affecting caribou habitat effectiveness with timber removal either directly on or adjacent to caribou habitat. You will see changes in the amount and distribution of suitable habitat. I found it interesting that the Parks Canada fellow referred to fire as a habitat loss, and yet fire is part of the system, and caribou habitat will rejuvenate through time, so I wouldn't equate fire to habitat loss per se, change in dynamics through time. Definitely, we're seeing alterations in predator-prey dynamics in both of the ecotypes. And as I mentioned, cumulative effects, in my opinion, is the issue, and forestry does contribute to that in terms of a limiting factor. The other one is around the issue of access. All industrial uses, as well as public human use, requires access to get into various areas, and roads and the access that it permits both affect mortality rates in some way, either through direct collisions or through human harvest or facilitated access by predators. And then some degree of sensory disturbance related to forestry, although I would say that is relatively minor. These are the caribou ranges in Alberta, and what I wanted to take a look at was what kind of an overlap do we have between forest management tenures and caribou habitat. Now the colors here aren't the best, but what you'll see is that when you overlay the forest management agreement areas onto these, we do have a fairly high degree of overlap. There are some areas of the Caribou Mountains, the herds of the north, portions of the Red Earth that are not under forestry tenure, and my apologies for these two not being exactly an overlay. But the message here is that most caribou range in Alberta has a fairly high overlap with forest management tenures. And this does not include, so there are three types of forest management tenures. One, are the area-based forest management agreement areas, but there's also timber quotas, primarily for coniferous volume-based allocations, and then some smaller timber permits. Also not shown on here are the various tenures that relate to oil and gas and minerals, etc. So when you look at the caribou range in Alberta, as we know, we've got the layer cake approach to resource allocation, and so each caribou range has got multiple overlapping tenures. A couple comments just briefly on forest management. Most companies in Alberta are, most if not all companies, are sort of following various versions of a natural disturbance model with a lot of emphasis in terms of developing planning targets using natural range of variation. In the boreal, where I'm most familiar, we're using fire-based as the natural disturbance, basing our planning approaches both at a landscape and stand level. And the emphasis here on variation, not wanting to do the same thing in all places. Incorporation of succession for MWM, stands for Mixed Wood Management. I've kept a few acronyms in here just for space regions. And one of the hypotheses under this natural disturbance model is that through time, initially we know that fire versus harvest, there are differences. In some cases fairly dramatic differences in plant and animal community responses. But the hypothesis is that through time you will see convergence. And so some companies, Al-Pac among them, are doing effectiveness monitoring relative to that hypothesis. And we've been on the ground for a relatively short amount of time, but in collaboration with the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, we are looking at some effectiveness monitoring. And we are demonstrating that 15 years after harvest and versus 15 years after fire, we are beginning to see that convergence using the approaches that we are both in planning and operations. So that's encouraging. Another comment to make relative to forest management planning is that we primarily focus on coarse filter or multi-species approaches. So in the past, that has not been the case. There have been a variety of single species based approaches, moose being a common one that's been used in many parts of North America to influence forest management planning. But most companies are now using more of a coarse filter approach, complemented by single species of focus when you deal with species at risk. So you're dealing with these trade-offs in terms of forest management planning principles, but the need to do single species management for things like species at risk. I'm going to touch on these in a bit more detail, but I just wanted to put up for a bit of a flavor of what are some of the management levers that can be pulled relative to forest management and things that can be used within the toolbox for caribou conservation planning. And I'll touch on some of these in a bit more detail because we do deal with changing the amount and distribution of age classes, habitat, through time. And so there's a variety of things that can be done. I'll touch on a variety of these as we go forward. On the reforestation side, one of the things that differentiates forestry from many aspects historically of the energy sector is that our reforestation is prompt because our future relies on getting things back into the ground and planted quite quickly. I think what we're hopefully seeing now is sort of a merging of this need to mitigate both the energy sector and forestry almost immediately after, and I think there's some big opportunities there in terms of moving forward in dealing with the cumulative effects issue through some coordinated reforestation. So if we now look at, we're going to touch on two things, one, the planning aspect, and two, the operational aspect. Sort of the planning process, and I'm not going to go through the lengthy details that walk you through this, other than to say that we deal with a changing hierarchy of scope, scale, and time as we move from sort of the allocation of the 10-year into forest management agreement through to 10 to 15-year forest management plans. And these are guided by the Alberta planning standard for developing a forest management plan. And a strong component of your forest management plan is the timber supply. I'll touch on that in a second. So you're dealing with a sort of 10 to 15-year plan that then goes down to a 5-year general development plan, annual operating plans, all the way down to what you're doing this month and next month in forest harvest plans. Throughout this process, you've got ongoing consultation and community engagement processes. Timber supply, again, lots of math that gets into here, and I'm not going to jump into that box, but it is a major component of a forest management plan. Many people think that the forest management plan is just the text that sits on the SRD website. All of these forest management plans are available publicly, but that companion document that has the backup timber supply, which has both an spatial or an amount, the annual allowable cut, but it also has a spatial component, a spatial harvest sequence, are two very important components of this forest management plan. And because it's driven by objective-based functions, you can make use of that approach in terms of conservation planning. And we'll highlight a couple of examples of that in a moment. The other thing is the long planning and evaluation horizons that forest management sector has. Not tens of months or tens of years, but hundreds of years in terms of evaluations in the evaluation horizon. Here's an example. This is the old Al-Pac forest management agreement area, and an example of the spatial harvest sequence shown for both conifer in green and deciduous. And the only intent here is to show that what we have to submit to the government is not just an annual allowable cut, but where are you going to go in the next 15 years? And then as you go through that 15-year spatial harvest sequence down to a 5-year, you begin to start picking, okay, within the 15 years, here's where we're going to go. So there's flexibility built into that approach in terms of linking the ideas of, okay, the potential for deferrals here, here, and here exist. And you can do that either before or during the development of your spatial harvest sequence. The complexity comes in when you start looking at overlapping tenures, not just between forest industry and the energy industry, but also within the forest industry. So Al-Pac, so it's a little bit hard to see on here, but the Al-Pac FMA is sort of built within this area. This is a study area that and I'm going to touch on this later, the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement is working on in northeastern Alberta, and it largely centers on the Al-Pac FMA. What's shown here are the caribou ranges that overlap the Al-Pac FMA, but it also shows the different colors here are used to highlight different combinations of companies that are affected on each of these forest management units. So within the Al-Pac FMA, we've got 11 forest management units. Within each one of those forest management units, you've got different companies that are being affected by the annual allowable cut. And if we start thinking about range-based planning, some of the caribou ranges go outside of the Al-Pac FMA, which is very common elsewhere in the province, where you, on a given caribou range, you can have a number of forestry companies. And so the complexity of just that one sector will begin to challenge the range-based planning approach that is envisioned within the recovery strategy. Add on top of that the need to deal with the other sectors, and you've got the challenge in front of you. So what are some things, some specific examples that are being done in terms of planning, forest management planning relative to caribou? We have the ability, when I say strata, you can sort of think of it in habitat type. We've got deciduous strata, we've got a coniferous strata. Within deciduous, depending on where in the province, in most cases, you'll just be having that as one strata, but within conifer you might have a pine strata, a white spruce strata, and black spruce strata. So you can, and companies are, setting targets for the amount of harvest that will be allocated in those. So some of the companies are using an NRV-based approach, so natural range of variability. Analysis is being done relative to, okay, how much historically has fire left in different age classes, and then you set targets, and your objective-driven function will then drive it to meet those targets. Other companies are using caribou risk-based approaches. So two noted examples are Canfor and Weyerhaeuser. And so 2020 or 2030 refers to a couple different things. In the Canfor model, what they've got is they want to have no less than 20% in old forest and no more than 20% in young forest. 2030 essentially relates to one portion of that, and that is Weyerhaeuser's got a target of no more than 20% in less than 30 years. So you can talk to them about the details of those, but it's a way in which they've used a caribou risk-based approach to develop their objective functions. You can also do subjective deletions. So, for example, Al-Pac has looked at our black spruce and pine strata, and we have subjectively deleted. So we've removed from our timber supply the poor black spruce and pine. So from a merchantability perspective, we don't want to even include them in our timber supply. From a caribou conservation perspective, it actually leads to quite a few thousands of hectares that aren't even being included in the timber supply process. So that was primarily dealing with amount, but all of these also, they're interconnected, the amount and spatial considerations. And so most companies across Canada are now moving away from 2-pass or 3-pass, multi-pass systems. So the sort of the old checkerboard approach to more of an aggregated harvest approach. This, from a caribou conservation perspective, allows you to bring together and change landscape patterns through time. So if you know that you need large aggregations of mature and old timber for caribou habitat, you better start generating that now, and the way to generate it now is when you do your harvest is to create these larger harvest areas, so that down the road they're going to be large, contiguous, mature and old areas. Residual attention, you can deal with that both at an in-block approach or at a landscape level, and so this can assist in providing connectivity both in the short term and in the longer term. So you're leaving trees strategically standing both within your harvest areas and between harvest areas. And deferrals. A number of the companies that submitted to me for ideas, they are they've committed to a variety of different deferrals. The companies under the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement have all submitted deferrals which allow us time to do the collaborative planning. And zoning. I'm going to touch on zoning in a minute. I think that it's a strategy that allows us to differentially apply management strategies in different portions of the province, or even within different areas within a caribou range. We'll talk a bit about that. Just as a sort of the not planned portion of the world, things like fire, mountain pine beetle, forest ant caterpillars, all of these must be dealt with when you're dealing with forest management planning, but they're not part of the planning process. Although we've now seen things like mountain pine beetle influencing the planning process and developing forest management amendments essentially to their plans that deal with the now emerged issue of mountain pine beetle. So zoning, this is an idea that's been around for quite a while, and CANFOR is going to be submitting a forest management plan that will take advantage of that, and it's going to build upon some of the work that the West Central landscape planning team did through the Alberta Caribou Committee. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. You can follow up with Jim Stevenson on some of those, but essentially it takes the landscape and it divides it into zones with rationale associated to what is influencing the creation of those zones. So zone 1 in this case is a relatively intact area with no forest harvesting history. The zone 3 in blue has got a fairly high amount of oil and gas activity and extensive timber harvesting. So you zone your landscape, and then you can apply a variety of different management tools to those different zones. And so what CANFOR is proposing is that in the zone 1 area, they are proposing for the term of their forest management plan they're going to be submitting a 10-year harvest deferral in that zone 1 area. And in zone 2, they've got a suite of harvesting activities that they're going to be following. Likewise, and again, my intention here is not to go into the details of them. In zone 3, there would be another suite of activities, and they will be differentially applied within these different zones. So if we switch now from the sort of the planning phase to the operational phase, things get a bit more sort of regulatory driven in that all companies and all of the operating ground rules are posted on the SRD website. They are specific to the forest management agreement area, but they are driven by a provincial template. So when you read the Caribou section of the OGRs for Al-Pac compared to CANFOR, they're very similar. But they do sort of influence the suite of operational activities that we undertake. I'll touch on a few of them and highlight a few points. So on some of the themes relative to roads, the OGRs, and some of the practices that are being followed in relation to those, and principles. If possible, follow existing either roads or other linear features. If possible, and some companies, it's almost exclusively, if they're moving into a new area, will use frozen ground access. And so then you can take advantage of things like seismic lines to just get into your areas. If you're going to be building either a higher class of road, you might want to utilize principles such as minimizing the grade that you're going to be doing. And in many cases, what we're dealing with here is temporary access. So you've got in-block or inter-block roads that you're going to be using for a year or two. So you get in, you use them with prompt reclamation. And the reclamation timelines are driven through the OGRs, so they're regulatory driven. Relative to timing, The suite of approaches that are being used relative to caribou areas vary considerably. When I first came to Alberta in the early 1990s, there was a big focus, and I think that's actually some of the reason that some of these previous caribou committees got going was around timing. And the dictum from the government that you had to be out of a certain area by a certain date, and raucous discussions ensued about, well, no, I don't think that's the date, what's the rationale for the date? So in some places, companies are still using firm dates, and they're either built into their OGRs or they're just company commitments. Other companies are following sort of an early in, early out philosophy. And then there's flexibility within that. If you have the opportunity to get in and get out of an area in 1 year, but it means you're going to have to go right through the breakup, that may be preferable to going into that area for 2 years consecutively. So, and then other approaches relative to timing would be don't do any of your non-frozen harvesting within caribou zone, or stay close to existing access if you do. Access itself is an issue relative to the caribou conservation issue, and use by people, many often referred to as access management, and predators is something that is dealt with relative to forestry operations. So again, I mentioned that we try to minimize the grade or the class of road that we're using, and so that means that you're going to have less people using it than a provincial highway. Fairly rapid reclamation, as I mentioned, to prevent both highway vehicle use and limit OHV use, or off-highway vehicle use. And I think that the approaches that many companies are taking relative to reclamation and sort of trashing up of roads is highly effective at limiting quad use of some of these roads. Some companies use gates, some companies don't use gates. Temporary bridge removal is something that companies are using they know they're going to have to use this road in multiple years, but by pulling out a bridge, it allows them to limit a bunch of the access that's going into there after they are out, especially in the summer. Sort of last touch in the operating ground rules, there is a series of sort of subsections related to lichen conservation. Different companies are taking different approaches to this. At Al-Pac, what we've developed are a set of sort of guidance to our planning and layout crews, where we can identify the high density lichen patches in pine, and we essentially ribbon them out as retention patches. Best done in the summer, and then the preference is in those areas to be doing winter operations. Research and monitoring, not going to get into the details here. Like the energy sector, companies have been doing both company-specific research as well as collaborative research for many decades, and in some cases have developed huge data sets of caribou telemetry and RSF models, etc. Within the forest management process, there is an extensive amount of implementation monitoring. Much of it is regulatory driven. So are we doing what we said we were going to do? There's a lot of that. What I think we need relative to the caribou conservation perspective is what we're doing effective for caribou conservation? And I think that across the board, from a land use perspective, this is where we need to focus future research efforts, is on this. I don't think we should be doing any more research for basic ecology perspectives. This is kind of sort of highlighting some of my thoughts for tomorrow. But any research that we do should be focused, in an adaptive management framework. And I'll use that term specifically because I think there's an excellent opportunity to use active adaptive management in the implementation and effectiveness monitoring of different land use practices and mitigation practices. As highlighted by Rick in his introductory comments, this is a collective challenge for us, and engagement and collaboration are a key aspect. The Alberta Caribou Committee, its predecessors, and its potential successors have been, I think, a very useful forum to generate discussion and provide debate. And I think there is a continued role for some type of such organization to continue forward. I think there's a variety of examples. Amit highlighted a few of them relative to some characteristics of existing collaborative relationships that should be used as examples. A variety of ones in the sort of the theme of integrated landscape management, Amit highlighted, and Al-Pac, for example, has got a variety of relationships with oil sands companies, and will be formalizing and increasing our interaction with them relative to the Caribou file. A sort of relative recent newcomer to this is the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, signed in May of 2010. I'm going to spend a couple minutes just talking about it because it does have a focus right now, especially on caribou conservation planning. So this was an agreement signed between all the members of the Forest Products Association of Canada and 9 environmental groups, and it was a decision after a couple of years of discussions to set aside the slinging of mud between camps and decide to work collaboratively on an agreed upon suite of goals. One of them was species at risk planning and implementation, with an initial focus on woodland caribou. And so in Alberta, so there's a series of regional working groups set up across the country. One of them is basically Boreal BC and Northeast British Columbia. And we have chosen Northeastern Alberta as the initial area for focus, and we are currently actively working on a caribou action plan for that area that would serve as input into sort of the provincial process. It would link to directions to the forestry companies operating in Northeast Alberta specifically, and would provide a bridge to engagement of the energy sector. Specifically on engagement, while the agreement was signed by 2 camps, the environmental groups and the forestry companies, we know that we have a need to engage the government of Alberta, Aboriginal communities, and the energy sector, and potentially others if we strategically agree that we need to do so. And so we've initiated that, and so this is just a heads up to, especially given this audience, the energy sector. If you're working in Northeastern Alberta, we want to be engaging you in this CBFA Caribou Action Planning process. Myself, along with Terry Antoniuk and John Nishi, were co-authors on a currently calling it Iteration 1 draft of a caribou methodological framework. And it provides direction. Unfortunately, I can't share that with you, although I would encourage you to perhaps send in a request to potentially get access to it, because there's nothing secret in this document, but the steering committee has currently sort of embargoed it to not share unless the steering committee has given permission. And what it does is basically just provides guidance in terms of what needs to be considered relative to caribou action planning. And coming out of this would be a CBFA caribou action plan. It would be input into provincial action planning, and would provide specific guidance to forestry companies. But on a variety of other topics, as I mentioned, this is a cumulative effects issue. It would link in with things that need to require engagement with the other sectors. Goal of the CBFA action planning process is to accelerate implementation. I'm not going to go through the flow chart on the right-hand side of the screen, but I will highlight that the CBFA itself and the action planning methodological framework that flows out of that do provide specific direction, but not the specifics of things that need to be included. So disturbance thresholds are mandated in the agreement. We need to include this concept of disturbance thresholds. It is a relatively young concept relative to land disturbance thresholds, and so there's a lot of work that needs to move forward on that. Zonation, while it's not mandated, it is something that you're seeing more and more frequently. The Alberta Caribou Committee recommended a zonation approach. The methodological framework recommends a zonation approach, because it's a way in which you can meld together differential suites of management activities in different areas. Best management practices, they're not enough. I think we've seen that demonstrated over time that if best management practices were enough, we wouldn't have caribou declining across Canada, but they are an important component. So there is a component for that. And then this dirty word of adaptive management it is written right into the CBFA. In fact, active adaptive management is written right into the agreement itself. So those are components so coming to a neighborhood near you, hopefully soon, will be discussions between CBFA signatories and others that need to be engaged. So last two slides touching on caribou conservation challenges, the direction coming out of the National Recovery Strategy, and I think that it flows all the way back to sort of provincial strategies, is the need to do range-based planning. It has not terribly been done before, certainly not effectively, but it is, I think, the direction to go. Overlapping tenures create challenges for range-based planning, but it is, I think, the direction that we need to go. This concept of thresholds and zoning, the land use framework certainly outlines both concepts as a direction forward. So we'll see if the land use framework survives the next election. I hope it does, because it's the first time I've seen in Alberta sort of things like cumulative effects, thresholds actually used and acknowledged. Trade-offs. We can't have everything everywhere all the time. Common quote that Brad Stelfox used for many years. But implicit in this whole thing of trade-offs is that concept. And so there are going to be discussions relative to trade-offs as we move into the discussions of thresholds. So as I commented yesterday in the Environment Canada session, the great science work that's been done through the Environment Canada science team is but one input and the beginning of a dialogue relative to land disturbance thresholds. And those discussions need to move forward into implementation in some fashion. I can't predict what they're going to look like, but it will be one input, and there's going to be a series of discussions as well as decisions that are going to be made not by scientists, but by society and politicians. This whole challenge between biodiversity conservation versus single species at risk conservation is going to be an ongoing challenge. Sarah sets us up for expectations that will be challenged by things like resource allocation to get the job done and climate change. Climate change, I think, is, speaking from experience here, I don't know how many people knew, but last January I decided to relive the glory of my youth, and I ruptured my Achilles tendon. And so now, coming on the 1-year anniversary, I declined going back to the team. But I think that climate change and white-tailed deer specifically are going to be an Achilles heel for caribou conservation challenges in the southern boreal. And I don't have a good solution for that one. On the opportunities front, three main things. I think that this dirty word of adaptive management, I think there truly is an opportunity with the rollout of the National Recovery Strategy. The Canadian Boreal Forest provides an opportunity as well to try and set up some active adaptive management frameworks across the country and within the province of Alberta. I think that we need to see some innovation and change. There's a term coming out of Star Trek, Kobayashi Maru. You have to think outside the box, because you will not find a solution within the box. Also talks about cheating as a way to get around that, but thinking outside the box and changing the box is got to be a part of our moving forward solution, and I think zonation and thresholds are two of the areas that can play into that. And then forums like this and the collaboration that comes with it, I think, are going to be critical. We've said that before, saying it again now. Let's hope history doesn't repeat itself, Rick, in terms of the time for actions now. Thanks.